So as I think, viewers are probably aware, right-wing commentators, probably more than anybody else, are the ones who are talking the most about the Frankfurt School today. They're constantly sounding the alarm over, as I said, this so-called cultural Marxism, which of course they see as a conspiracy to destroy Western society that originated with the Frankfurt School. And, I think it goes without saying that a lot of these right-wing pundits who are invoking the Frankfurt School are not really super concerned with what the Frankfurt School was actually saying. In fact, the Fox News pundit, Mark Levin, famously refers to the Frankfurt School as the Franklin School, both on air on Fox News and also in his book, American Marxism. So accuracy maybe for them is not the point. But I was wondering if you guys have any thoughts on why the right is so preoccupied with what is honestly a pretty obscure group of thinkers.
Well, I'll just say one thing that's important to note is that Marcuse's influence is not just political. It's also intellectual, right? And this is even truer of people like Adorno and Horkheimer, people we've mentioned at the top of the program. Benjamin, exactly, who are also members of the Frankfurt School. And what I mean by that is there's a sort of, if you want to think of it, a critical theory industrial complex in the academy and in academic publishing as well, that I think has shaped a lot of some of the most kind of, depending on your perspective, radical or pseudo-radical kind of dogmas, frankly, in higher education and in the intellectual sort of public sphere, especially around questions of race, gender, sexuality, disability, so on and so forth. And I think that the right just loves to dig into that and sort of stoke a lot of outrage, and make a lot of hay from the existence of all of that. And if you look at the footnotes, look at the citations, a lot of the sort of the basis of it in a very maybe roundabout way is Adorno, Horkheimer, Benjamin. A lot of these figures loom large in a lot of this sort of critical theory discourse. And that's not to suggest that somehow like Adorno is sort of anticipating, some of the sort of, recent contemporary sort of theory. But we can even identify in the example of Marcuse, his student, his most famous student certainly is Angela Davis, who I think many people identify with, critical race theory, with many of the sort of ideas that are sort of under the microscope of, Fox News hosts right now. So you don't have to even look very far.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll initially say, and I don't throw this around a lot, but I think there's a wee bit of anti-Semitism in this right-wing canard. These were like Jewish intellectuals who came to America and, have supposedly had a subversive influence on American culture. So I think that's a little bit of thing, speaking as a Jew. But beyond that, what's ironic about what Ben points out is that, what academia has largely done to these figures, ironically, is to take the Marxism out. Like when I studied Walter Benjamin, who I just mentioned, this kind of bizarre, lyrical, mystical critic and political writer, when I studied him in college, I remember after my sort of political awakening, going back to the texts and being like, oh, wow, there are like footnotes to like Karl Kautsky and Lenin all over these texts. And I literally hadn't even like penetrated, because it was just like what Marxism was, what a critique of capitalism was, what putting the capitalist class as the central obstacle to political change, what having like radically egalitarian politics looked like, was just so off the table in like academic circles. So ironically, what has been preserved from a lot of these thinkers is what's least Marxist about them, not like cultural Marxism. Ben, it looks like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, well, I just want to point out another irony that I think we need to appreciate, which is that these figures, the Frankfurt School, saw themselves as saving bourgeois civilization, essentially, as rescuing it from fascism. And I mean, I think the idea that, you know, they are enemies of sort of Western civilization or whatever it is that the sort of, you know, the right is saying is so bizarre when you think about how reverent they were towards so much of, you know, European culture, whether it's music or literature or art, and how much that informed, I mean, even just Marcuse, he's really a kind of a Marxo-Schillerian. I was joking with a friend. I mean, his interest in Schiller's poetry and aesthetic theories, you know, very much a part of his work, just as much as Marxism is. And so it just suggests how little engagement with these figures there actually is coming from these critics or these pundits.
But I will say this, like, look, like what Ben said earlier, you know, in stereotypes, there's sometimes a seed of truth. Like, the fact is, like, what at least part of the audience, the part of the audience that we as the left might want to rescue from, like, people who read this right-wing stuff. Some of it's just like, you know, whatever, managers who are getting their whole worldview confirmed that, like, all of their employees are, you know, subject to a hostile Marxist conspiracy, and that's why they, like, are taking long breaks or something. And those people, you know, fuck them, not part of the coalition. But, you know, those people who we are winnable potentially to the left, there is an idea that comes out of the last generation that legitimately, I think you could say there are moments in, you know, Marcuse that feel this way, where it's like, you know, I'm saying to the working class, like, screw you for having benighted values, for not being humane enough, not being focused enough on peace and love, for caring too much about having a 2-car garage. You know, you're backward, you're behind the times, you're part of the problem. Like, you can find sort of seeds of this kind of thing in Marcuse, and certainly in some of the New Left people that, you know, took up Marcuse. There was this sense that, like, oh, thank God we don't have to, like, think about the working class anymore. Like, you know, because they're like, who wants to talk about them? So that kind of stuff is, like, terrible and damaging. And where Marcuse, it came out of, like, a sense of, you know, frustration and despair, with this being like, look, the working class is not to blame for, like, they're not being mobilized now, but, like, we need them and they're not arising, and how frustrating is it for someone who literally lived through a revolution in Germany and was, like, then sees the US and is like, what's going on? Like, please do something. That there's a sense of pathos in Marcuse that some of his New Left successors did not so much have. There was a sense of kind of self congratulation and pride in being, like, woke, as it were, you know, not the parlance of the time, but the same idea. And so I think, like, that kind of stuff we really want to leave behind and say that, like, you know, you can't really trace a direct lineage like someone like Matt Taibbi does or something from, like, Marcuse to, like, some of the excesses of, like, middle class culture today. But you can maybe say something about how, like, there was a, you know, what, rather than treat as a dilemma, how do we organize the working class into left-wing politics? Instead, it was treated as, like, a done deal and even a kind of self-congratulation for the middle class. And we can't do that kind of thing.
Yeah, I want to stay on that point for a second, because toward the end of your Catalyst essay, you know, right-wing fear-mongering aside, you do kind of talk a little bit about how there is sort of this unfortunate and perhaps accidental legacy of the Frankfurt School, where you now have these kinds of tendencies within especially contemporary liberalism, where you see, and I'm going to quote from your essay, you write, the replacement of interest-based politics by ethics, self-expression and identity, of class organization by cultural contestation, of majoritarian aspiration by elite pose. And Jeremy, that was kind of what you were just talking about, like what you think, you know, we should obviously slough off off. Can you guys say a little bit more about how this happened and how the left can reclaim a sort of more class-focused legacy of the Frankfurt School?
Well, I can just say a little bit about how this happened. I mean, I think we've covered some of this, but I think an important piece of the puzzle is the notion that the working class is bought off, lock, stock, and barrel, just utterly absorbed into the system, incorporated, comfortable. I think at one point we quote Marcuse saying there's nothing more bourgeois than a member of the working class. And this would have been in like 1969, 1970. And I think that that's a notion that's, I mean, it's incorrect, first of all, but it also, I think it's had a very damaging legacy. One that we can associate in large part with elements of the New Left that Jeremy has just talked about. And so I just want to focus on one thing, which is that, even just within one-dimensional man, Marcuse's portrayal of the working class as, comfortable with the status quo, supporting it, conservatizing influence in many ways. He relies on evidence that, in fact, sometimes contradicts his conclusions. He draws, for example, on a study of industrial workers, and I believe in auto plants, that he reads a certain way as suggesting that they are not militant, they are not really raising any kind of issues with their working conditions, that they're utterly, complacent. When in fact, the industrial sociology that he was citing kind of drew the opposite conclusion. And one of his critics actually points this out. And so, I think we have to be very careful and distinguish, and this is key, between believing that working class people are complacent, are utterly, happy with the system as it exists. In fact, the arch conservative supporters of the status quo. And on the other hand, I think a more realistic notion that working class people don't know what they need to do in order to change a system that they recognize damn well is unjust, is inequitable, is undemocratic. And I think that's where, in some ways, Marcuse's book, I think, does lend itself to an understanding of false consciousness, of people not knowing what's in their interest, of not acting in their interest, that I think we need to be careful about taking away from how we understand mass politics, because in large part, I think the condescension, the sort of also the post-materialist sort of quest for some kind of new basis of political transformation that we're talking about, I think a lot of it starts there.
Yeah, I was just reminded of there's an anecdote. I don't think we do this in the article, but one of my faves is the British sociologist, John Goldthorpe, who was like a great study, did a lot of studies of stratification and of working class life in Britain. And he did this major study of a plant, I think it was an auto plant in Vauxhall in the UK. And the study basically concludes like these workers are totally absorbed, they're totally bought off, they don't care, they're just like totally happy with how things are. A couple of union militants like kind of pass around a flyer with like the study summary, and it says on top like, this guy thinks you're dopes, and are like happy with the status quo, and it leads to like one of the big strikes in like early 70s England. So so there's that. And I think Vivek Chibber's work on kind of separating out consent from resignation, that this period, the intellectuals broadly associated with Western Marxism were too quick to rule forms of resignation to see them as consent. So working class people like not knowing how to change their lives and also having things to lose, and so being less maybe inclined to change the society. Those things are very different than being like enthusiastic supporters of the society, as I think any organizer would tell you. It's like a very different problem to deal with somebody who's like afraid of like what they have to lose or unsure about what to do, as opposed to someone who is like a hardcore supporter of like the existing status quo. They're just different problems that I think broadly the Frankfurt School often kind of melded together a little too quickly. And I would say that I think broadly, like presuming that it is possible to do interest. Oh, that's right. I was going to say that, look, what Marcuse started with, which is that revolution is extremely unlikely in the advanced capitalist world. So we need to think about politics in a different register. Also, that a number of things about advanced capitalism separate and disorganize working people, even at the height of working class organization in the advanced capitalist West, let alone in our world today, where there's been increased atomization, blowing apart of working class neighborhoods through occupational change, through industrial change, through deindustrialization. There's, again, the loss of kind of cultural forms of cohesion that used to exist, and in an authentic kind of working class culture. Like these kinds of things, you've got to start your analysis there. Otherwise, you come off as like the revolution's tomorrow, like these sectarian groups. And Marcuse, I think, was right to think these guys are crazy. Like it's not happening. Like the US is not tomorrow going to overthrow capitalism as a whole. But like you can also say that there is a lot of room to organize and to grow if you take seriously what working people's actual problems and struggles are, and if you take seriously the tasks of organizing, of resuscitating the organizations that capitalism constantly pulverizes, of working with the union movement that exists, of working with working mass organizations that exist and building them, and building left organizations like the DSA, and building these things and deepening their roots to like give working class people like to meet their needs and to express their will in politics, and also to like rebuild some of the shattered social fabric that allows people to be intimidated out of their human rights, as it were.
So maybe what we need to do is get academics to just like leaflet plants with their publications about workers being dumb, and maybe that will be the spark. I don't know. But to kind of return to this idea around, integration, co-optation, I think it's fair to say many of us on the Bernie, Jacobin left, whatever, social democracies at least are kind of medium-term political horizon, even if it's not our desired end goal. And, in short, that would mean, of course, winning reforms, winning power in the state, expanding the union movement. But, as you point out, Marcuse's work kind of warns us that this path can lead to an integration and may even just reinforce the strength of capitalism. And maybe put another way, I've heard Adolf Reed say a few times that, we can keep doing this thing of pushing social democracy to its limits before capital stages a coup, basically until the sun burns out. We can kind of keep doing this over and over. So I don't know, how should we think about this dilemma of social democracy, like in our own lifetime?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to just go back to Marcuse's biography for a second and remember that he is a child of the German Revolution. And, he witnessed in his interpretation, in many people's interpretations, the betrayal of social democracy, right? The defeat of the revolutionary left at the hands of the German Social Democratic Party. And so I think a real sort of combativeness toward social democracy as the sort of humane face of capitalism is a through line in his work. And I think it's consonant with a lot of the reception of his work and a lot of ideas we associate with the New Left about not wanting to be tainted by complicity with the governing parties, with the existing system, with the ruling class, and avoiding anything that is insufficiently revolutionary. I think we have to leave that way of thinking behind. I just think the stakes are too high at this moment in history. And I also just think that, and critics of Marcuse's book at the time that it was published pointed this out, that the social democracy, the welfare state, these are achievements of political contestation and struggle, right? These are victories. They they may have some kind of ambiguous consequences in terms of how they play out politically. But nonetheless, they're achievements that we don't want to give up on or turn our backs on, and we should recognize them for what they are. And I think that they're the starting point of, and the basis on which we organize, a much more successful and meaningfully democratic set of, social transformations, right? So, and I think that this is actually in many ways sort of the crux of our article in terms of where we find much of Marcuse's assumptions to be lacking, many of his assumptions to be lacking. So maybe, Jeremy, I'll hand it off to you there.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, in one sense, an interesting empirical question of there is a aspect of the Leninist tradition that Marcuse is clearly a part of, which kind of presumes that victories, for social, partial victories, are demobilizing. And I actually think the jury's kind of out on that, insofar as actually, if you look at social democracies in Scandinavia, they were doing more, they were using their victories of the 30s, say, to expand their coalition, to expand the welfare state. And then especially in the 60s and 70s, there were radical currents within them who were pushing for real socialization of the means of production. And I think it's arguable whether it was inevitable those things would go down in defeat, the Meitner plan or whatever, versus just it's politics. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And that's just it. Marxists sometimes like to think of everything as it's all written in the structure, the deep DNA of capitalism, but some of it might be really political. I will say also, ultimately it seems to me, if you do agree with Marcuse's presumption that workers do have something to lose in advanced capitalist countries and that revolution is highly unlikely, then you have to figure out some sort of democratic road. And also that full socialization of the means of production has never been a 51% program that could win a majority. These are things you really have to take and think about, how they affect your ultimate kind of sense of how social change might play out. That said, Marcuse's sense that that there would need to be continuing sources of revivification for this to work, that the left would have to be ready in a case where it won victories. It would have to be ready to take up new problems. It would have to be ready to be ambitious. It would have to be ready to think about expanding its coalition even further and of chipping away at the power of capital. That all seems to me true and something, God, I hope that this reconciliation bill, say, passes in some sort of recognizable form. And if it does, it will be due to people like Bernie and all the, millions of activists who put their time, their lives on hold to give everything they could to this movement and to organize. That said, it will be the very beginning of a process. And I think, again, my hope about and my feeling about today's left, there was some thought of if Biden wins, Trump won and that activated everyone. If Biden wins, everyone's going to go to sleep again. I just think we're living through a period of struggles, popular movements, class conflicts, radicalization of the right, which is tending in the direction to keep people in motion and in struggle. And so I think winning reforms can honestly only do us good, at least at this moment in history, though it's something to kind of keep in mind, how to pay attention to the dangers of co-optation as you hopefully continue to win.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.